And it's mentioned once again in the book of Hebrews, okay? In chapter 11, which is called the Hall of Fame of Faith, basically. It has a Hall of Fame of people who stepped out in faith. And one of the things that's really interesting is that it says basically, you came from Ur, you're living in Haran, and now I want you to leave all of your extended family, and I want you to complete that trip down south into the land of Canaan. And so he did that, and he was 75 years old. So if you've been retired for 10 years and you're 75, God's just getting started with you yet. Just thought you ought to know that. It's never too late. Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. Our goal is to coach you up in your faith because it's what you think, it's what you believe, what you choose to do, what you know that makes all the difference in your life. It's not what anybody else tells you, what anybody else knows, what anybody else actually believes about you. In essence, that's all irrelevant when it comes to you navigating the ups and downs of this wonderful thing, this crazy thing, this messed up thing we call life. And that's what the Salty Pastor Podcast is all about. We're not here to tell you what to do necessarily. We're not here to tell you what to think. We want to focus on how to form your thinking. Because the more you understand what you believe and why you believe it, the more you discover your purpose in life. When you can understand how you're wired and why you think the way you do, the conclusions that you come to, the decisions you make, that's when you can navigate life in an incredibly different way. There are things that nobody else can tell you, give you, or do for you. And the reason why so many people miss out on life, they end up having a miserable life, is because they don't know who they are, what they believe, and why they are on the face of this planet. So Salty Pastor is all about helping you discover the answers to those questions. And guess what? Those questions have to be answered if you want to live a real, authentic life. And when you answer them for yourself, when you know deep in your heart, these are my answers, it doesn't matter how many challenges, how many obstacles, failures, mistakes, or setbacks you have in your life, because you will have the skills, you'll have the convictions, the confidence, the courage to navigate all those ups and downs successfully. So one way to say it is, don't let life live you, but you need to start living your life. I am your Salty Pastor, Dr. Douglas Peak, highly educated in things that nobody really cares about anymore. And I have over 37 years of full-time ministry experience. And what I want to do is I just want to share just kind of, my thoughts and what I'm thinking on things in order to help you think through the things that are going on in your life. So we're going to start a brand new series of in-depth kind of study or whatever. And it's all about transitions. And it's how do we face transitions? How do we prepare ourselves for transitions that happen unexpectedly? What happens when we're in transitions? What the pitfalls of transitions are? What the successful things to look for in transitions could be? In the end, the whole point is that we're all going through transitions all throughout our life. And I want to look at these important moments when you face a transition in your life, whether it's planned or unplanned, expected or unexpected. And the reason I want to focus on that is because the way we approach them and how we think in the midst of them make all the difference in how we navigate them. So that's what this series is all going to be about. Now, why are we going to talk about transitions? Well, because life is filled with them. You're going to have them, and the older you get, the more they stack up. The number one factor that causes transitions in your life is time. That's right. It's the fact that you are locked in a space-time continuum. We simply grow up. We go through rites of passage. Every decade in life has a different challenge. Time stops for no one, and time always brings change no matter what. For instance, the transition from junior high to high school or middle school to high school is a huge transition for early teenagers. The transition from graduating high school and then taking your next step is even bigger. You may go into the military, you may go to the university or college, you may go into the trades. whatever it is, that's a big step because you're really stepping out into a whole new life. Whatever you're doing in your 20s ends up setting the tone for all the other ensuing decades until you retire. It's really quite amazing. In your 30s, you start dealing with all the emotional stuff with how you were raised and all the mistakes that maybe you made in high school, in college, or your early 20s. When you're 30s, you start to really process that. You start to see patterns of thinking and emotional behaviors that impact your moods and your decision making. It's not until you're in your 30s when you start dealing with that. That's a massive transition that most people go through. When you get to your 40s and your early 50s, a lot of times what you're doing is you're transitioning kids from little kids. Now they're into their teen years. Some are going to college. That's a huge transition. And in your late 50s, mid 50s, late 50s, a lot of people are looking at empty nest. They start planning for retirement. All of these things are massive transitions. And then when you retire, that thing is huge. It's a massive shift. So many people are unprepared for the emotional roller coaster they go through when they retire. So what is the point? The point is that your life is filled with transitions just because of time. They're filled with transitions because you get married, you have kids, your kids grow up, they leave. Your parents, you have to take care of them. You have loss. All of these things create transitions in your life. Guess what else creates transitions in your life? Well, bad things. That's right, tragedy. No single life escapes a tragic event. Some people can live a charmed life, but those people are unicorns. 99.9% of everybody out there faces a massive tragedy in their life. And that is a huge thing to go through, and it's a huge transition. Sometimes it's just loss. At some point, you're going to lose people that you love close to you. And you can lose them in all sorts of different ways. You can lose them in an accident. They pass away, or maybe they just grow old and then they pass away, or you have to move and because of something out of your control. There's so many different reasons why we experience loss. But whenever we experience loss because of change, that brings pain in our lives, right? And so that transition, even if it was expected, is painful. And if we don't realize that, it has a huge negative impact on our life. Sometimes growth, when you grow, creates all kinds of transitions. If you start a company and then, gosh, it takes off, guess what? You're going to go through a lot of transitions. In my case, when I came to the church here in Boise, Idaho, it's like 100 and something people. I don't even remember. And it was a little tiny church in a little tiny building. And then over the years, just kind of kept growing and growing, and we build and add, and it grow more, and we do. And then it just got really, really big. And every time we went through growing pains and transitions, and it was really difficult. It's really difficult. So sometimes our transitions are just a result of good things happening in our lives, right? You have a baby. Wow, that's awesome. And then you have 2 or 3 more. And now you're like, oh my goodness. That's a huge transition when you start growing your family. Sometimes transitions are planned. Like, for instance, maybe you plan to expand your family, or plan to start a company, or plan to do something of that nature. And those transitions can be planned. But the transitions that hit us the hardest, I think, are the ones that are unplanned, right? So my question for you in this series is, what do you do? Is there anything that you can get ready for when a transition happens in your life? In other words, is there something that I can do to develop myself so that whenever I face transitions, and you're going to face them, whether you face planned ones or unplanned ones, because both are going to happen, is there any way to prepare yourself to navigate them successfully? And in order to do that, I think it's important to really think about transitions, think about their impact on us, think about what research says about people, how they respond into change and transitions. So we're going to dig into all of this stuff, right? And we're going to talk about it, and we're going to try to see if there's any answers. Now, what we're going to talk about today is probably one of the most common experiences in any transition that most people don't talk about. What we're going to talk about now is called the fog. And the fog is basically what happens when you're in an unexpected transition. It's really powerful because what it does is it basically, it disorients you and it makes it so that you can't see very far in front of you. And so you can't see a path out, right? It's like this transition hits you and you're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. How do I navigate this? I just don't know. But what's interesting is the fog also hits you when you have a planned transition. Like for instance, you're a young couple and you're having your first child and the child comes and you go, boom. You're like, oh my goodness, I don't know how to handle that. And it's like, it's exciting, but then you also have this fog of, well, I don't know what to do. And sometimes the fog creates anxiety in your life because you're like, well, what if I mess this up or I make a mistake or I do something that's going to hurt this little baby for the rest of its life? I mean, you have a lot of those types of feelings. So we're going to talk about this thing called the fog. And the first thing we want to do when we talk about the fog, of course, is we want to go to Scripture. And we want to say, well, what stories in the Bible have to do with transitions? And how did these people navigate them? And can we glean anything from them? And so what I thought would be really, really good is if we talked about probably some of the best and biggest transitions you could ever read about back in the book of Genesis, about the life of Abram, who became Abraham, who became the father of the Jews. What's interesting, though, is he's also, through Ishmael, the father of many people who are Muslim and follow Islam as well. They claim Abraham as their father. And Arabs claim Abraham as their father, so ethnically. So it's really interesting that this guy has such a seminal part on such a massive part of the world today. And so what's really interesting is I just thought, let's read a little bit about his life and where it started off. And the first thing we hear about is that we hear about the descendants of Noah, okay? And one of them was Shem. And in chapter 11, it talks about all of these people. What's really interesting is it says that these are, verse 27 of chapter 11, it says, now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram. So there you have it. Abram, who became Abraham, Father Abraham, was the son of Terah, okay? And what's interesting is they were living in the land of Ur, the Chaldeans, which is kind of down on the coast in what is close to modern-day Kuwait. If you're familiar with your Middle East geography, which not a lot of people are, you have a thing called the Fertile Crescent, and like you have the Mediterranean Sea, and then, kind of on the west, and then you have the land of Canaan. And then if you go straight up through Syria, you dogleg to the right, and you go down the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and that's where Iraq is. And you kind of go down there all the way until you hit, what is that sea down there? It's not the Red Sea, but it's kind of the Persian Gulf area. And you get down into that area, and that's where modern-day Kuwait is. And so that's where Ur was. It's located down there. And so what happens is it says that Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And Sarah was barren, and she had no children. Verse 31, Terah took Abram and his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. Now, Haran is, if you look, this Fertile Crescent looks kind of like a crescent moon or like a boomerang a little bit. And so if you go way down here and then you kind of come up and around, it's kind of up there in that area, right? Kind of on the border of northern Iraq, maybe far eastern Turkey, kind of in Iran area. So it's kind of in there. And so where he did is he stopped there in Haran, okay? And then what happened is Terah died. And when Terah died in Haran with Abram, chapter 12 starts. And chapter 12 says this, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curses you, you will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now, verses 1, 2, and 3 are considered the Abramic covenant, okay? Now, there's a kind of a discipline in hermeneutics, or the study of the Bible, that goes through and studies all the covenants that God made with people. So there was the Adamic covenant, and this is the covenant that God had with Adam, right? Then there was the Mosaic covenant, the one that he had with Moses, right? There was that was a little later, but there was the Noahic, or the covenant with Noah, and then this one with Abram, who becomes Abraham, right? And what's really interesting is then later on was the one with Moses, and then the Davidic covenant. And so you look at all these covenants and you try to find the significance of them because they led up to the covenant with Jesus. And so there's this connection through all of the covenants, and people study them, and they glean a lot of insight and wisdom from this. And that's what this verses 1, 2, and 3 are, is that this was the Abramic covenant. And it's mentioned once again in the book of Hebrews, okay? In chapter 11, which is called the Hall of Fame of Faith, basically. It has a Hall of Fame of people who stepped out in faith. And one of the things that's really interesting is that it says, basically, you came from Ur, you're living in Haran, and now I want you to leave all of your extended family, and I want you to complete that trip down south into the land of Canaan. And so he did that, and he was 75 years old. So if you've been retired for 10 years and you're 75, God's just getting started with you yet. Just thought you ought to know that. It's never too late to step out in faith. Now, what's really interesting is if you kind of look, what's so interesting is he gets to the land of Canaan, and then he settles there for a little bit. And the Lord says in verse 7, to your descendants, I will give this land. So he builds an altar there. Now, in verse 10, so he goes there, he moves there, and guess what's the first thing that happens, right? He gets a promise from the Lord, I'm going to give you this land. And then a massive famine breaks out in verse 10. So Abram had to leave this land, and he went down to Egypt to sojourn there, meaning he had to live there for a period of time, and the famine was severe in the land. And it came by that when he got there, he was so worried that he was a foreigner and they were going to kill him because his wife was so beautiful that he made her lie. Pharaoh then tries to marry her, and then a plague comes on Pharaoh's household. He finds out the truth, and then he basically says, verse 19, why did you tell me she was your sister? And I took her for my wife. Now get out of here. Take her and go. And so Pharaoh commanded his men that they escorted him and his wife and all that belonged to him. And so he then leaves Egypt. But what's really interesting is it says he was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold. So when he left Egypt, he had a massive entourage. He was very, very wealthy. So it was a huge caravan traveling back up there. And then he settles again. And then he gets involved in a war with different kings. And then up to this point, he's like, God, I'm 90 now. If you look in chapter 15, and he says, look, Abram, you're going to have a son. And then he gets nervous about that. And so Sarah, or Sarai at this time, says, here, sleep with my handmaiden named Hagar. Hagar then has a child who becomes known as Ishmael, and Ishmael is the father of Arabs ethnically, but also considered the father of Islam, kind of passing through to them. So that's a really interesting phenomena in that point. And so, but then later on, what happens is that Sarai becomes Sarah when she gets pregnant and gives birth to Isaac. And so it's really interesting how all this goes on. And that's not until chapter 18. And then there's Sodom and Gomorrah. And my point in sharing this whole story with you, I can't go through and read it just chapter after chapter after, but it's like 10 chapters here almost in the book of Genesis that revolve around everything going on with Abraham. And the issue is it's really interesting. He steps out in faith to leave Haran with his family. He gets to Canaan, then he goes to Egypt, then he goes back, Then he gets in a war with all these other kings. And then after that, he still doesn't have a son. And so he's worried about that. And then he births a son through Sarah's handmaiden, and that is Hagar. And then finally, after all this time, he finally gives birth to his own son. And Isaac is the father of the Jews. So it's really kind of fascinating to me how he steps out in faith, and yet just because he steps out in faith, he has to go through so many different transitions over and over and over again. And I'm just so curious as to why that might be. Let's see if we can find an answer. So in order to find the answer, I went to Hebrews chapter 11. And it's really interesting because look at what verse 1 says. It says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the men of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts, and through faith, though he is dead, still speaks. By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God took him up, for he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. And without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him." That, to me, is a powerful answer to the question in transitions. And that is, I guarantee you're going to go through transitions in your life. I guarantee some will be expected. I guarantee some will be unexpected. You can go through them with God, believing that he is there, or you can go through them without God, believing that there is no meaning, purpose, rhyme, or reason to what you're going through. It's a simple choice, and it begins with what you choose to believe, because what you believe is one of the most important things about you. Now, if you choose to believe there is no God, then you are choosing to believe there is no meaning or purpose in what you are going through. Now, you can believe that there is no God and learn things as you go through them, but you cannot believe that there is a deeper purpose or a deeper understanding of why these things are happening. Now, that doesn't mean you'll answer the question, oh, I know why this is happening to me. But what it does do is it allows you transcendence in the midst of your transition. It allows you to rise above the emotional impact your transition has on you. It allows you to step back and be more objective, if only for a moment, in order to gain a deeper understanding that even though you may not understand why it happened to you, you're like, there can be a purpose in this, and it can mold me and shape me in ways that I still have yet to understand. And even if what happened to you was evil or unjust, we can quote Joseph later on in the book of Genesis, where he tells his brothers, what you meant for evil, God intended for good. So that's a powerful thing. How is it that you can take purpose out of an unexpected transition in your life that's unjust or maybe even evil? Well, you can, because if there's a God, he can redeem it. If there is no God, you can learn something, but there's no redemption of that thing. You can plan to never allow that to happen to you again and build really great defense if there is no God, or you can allow God to redeem, heal, and restore you and turn you into somebody you never even imagined. And so that's what's really interesting about transitions, is that you have to choose up front whether you believe there is a God. Because if you believe there is a God, you can have faith in the midst of your transition. If you believe there is no God, he says, it's really difficult to have faith or hope or assurance, even in the midst of the most tragic things. So he goes on to say something else, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being warned by God about the things not yet seen, in respect or reverence, prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which God condemned the world and became an heir to the righteousness which is accorded to faith. Verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Listen to what he says next. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had made a promise to her. Therefore, also, there was born of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So what's really interesting is he's saying that one of the things that transitions do is they develop faith. It's all about faith, whether they're expected or unexpected. So if you believe there's a God, then your faith is going to be impacted by the transition. Notice how I said that. Because sometimes our faith is negatively impacted by a transition. I remember a story of a young couple had their first baby. They were so excited. They'd prayed, they'd anointed, they'd done all of these things, and they were just so excited about their first baby. They bring their baby home, and the baby has colic, right? And it had some digestive issues. And for the next 6 months, that young family, those young parents, never got more than 45 minutes of sleep. And over time, that lack of sleep just unraveled them. It just totally unraveled them. It unraveled their joy. It unraveled their happiness. It unraveled their marriage a little, it unraveled their faith. It unraveled everything. And what was so interesting is that it took a long time for them, once that child got out of that, to kind of reweave their faith back together. And I remember them talking about how they wish that nobody would ever go through this. But the one thing that they did say is that we learned things about our marriage that would have plagued us so much further in the future. And because we were in such a bad way and so unraveled, we were able to address those things and fix them. Because when you're unraveled sometimes and you're totally exhausted, you don't have a lot of pride, right? And it's in humility where we also often can find change. Is we have to humble ourselves before the Lord. And I can tell you this, if you're angry or you have bitterness, you are not humble. You can't be both at the same time. And so for that young couple, they don't wish that on anybody, but what they did learn is that they addressed things in humility that gave them a lot of strength in their marriage later on. And so my point is that faith is always impacted in a transition. And if you ahead of time think about your faith, consider your faith, develop your faith, when you get into a transition, then you're going to be able to see your faith not negatively impacted, but positively impacted. Now, positive doesn't mean everything's going to go great. But what it does mean is when your faith is pushed and stretched and pulled and broken and people shoot holes in it, it will be resilient. It will endure. And what happens is after that stretching and that pulling and that pushing, what you find out is you have a faith that you never imagined you could have. Now, you can't go through this, what I call the fog, expecting to know what the end looks like. And on Thursday, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to specifically navigate the fog of transitions. So this is Salty Pastor. I just hope you're doing well. Please go to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe. Also, go to our website and look at what we're doing there. If you'd like to donate, click on the donate button. And we're seeing the Salty Pastor podcast grow. We've passed 60,000 downloads, which is pretty remarkable. And you have been a part of it. So I just want to say a big shout out and thank you to the Salty Pastor crew for listening and sharing this with your friends. And if you know anybody that is going through a transition or might be having a transition coming up, I hope that you share this series with them, because it just might make the difference of how they go through it and how their faith might grow. This is Salty Pastor signing off. And remember, always think for yourself.